Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you will never miss an episode. Android users can find us and subscribe on your Play Music app. Apple users can find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Stitcher. You can follow us on Spreaker. And you can find the podcasts on jimmyhinton.org or findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so that we can spread the word. Let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast, the Speaking Out on the Sex Abuse podcast, with host Jimmy Hinton
and Jimmy's mom, Clara.
We just wanted to sound official there. Did it work? All right. In our quest to become more professional, right?
Right.
So, this week, we want to talk about things that the church can do to improve the quality of life for survivors of abuse. Because this is really important to us. This is close to our heart. And let's see, a couple weeks ago, I think we talked about the long-term effects that abuse has on survivors of abuse. And in that process, you know, we want to talk about positive things and ways that we can affect positive change, because I think it can become depressing for survivors and advocates really quickly, because we know all the ugly, dark stuff that people are capable of. I just read you an email a couple minutes ago.
Right.
You know,
Yes.
we know that a lot of church leaders can just be really nasty, horrible people. And those are people who aren't even necessarily abusers. That's just people who respond poorly to abuse. So we know that exists. We know that's out there. And then you have, on the other end of the spectrum, you have churches that are just exceptional. They respond to abuse really well. They do everything in their power to make it an environment that's safe for kids and for vulnerable people, and they just do it really well from start to finish.
Right.
But then you have kind of in the middle of that, which probably my guess is that's where the majority of churches are. They're churches that are just kind of plugging along, doing their thing. They're doing their church thing. And abuse isn't really on their radar, but abuse is either happening in the church, or they have a lot of survivors that are part of that congregation, that make up a big part of that congregation, and it's just not on their radar.
Well, Jimmy, and
they're probably open,
right, and
to learning.
Not in defense is the wrong word to use, but for the sake of the church, abuse wasn't on anybody's radar.
Certainly wasn't on my radar.
No.
As I was 2 years into my ministry.
Right.
Whenever we found out about my dad,
right.
and
had that
it wasn't on my radar.
Not at all. Not at all. When the big Sandusky case blew up, I think that's what, and your dad, those two things simultaneously, that was our awakening.
Mm-hmm.
And I think until then, I'll be honest with you, I never thought about it.
No, it's not that we didn't care about people who were being abused. We just didn't realize it was such an epidemic.
We were not aware.
Because we weren't personally affected. So I think that's the case for a lot of people.
Right.
But for all of the survivors who are in our congregations, and they're in every congregation.
Yes.
I don't care if it's a congregation of 10 people or 10,000 people. There are survivors of abuse whose worlds have been completely rocked because of their abuse. So they're in our churches.
Right.
Their lives have been affected, so we need to be talking about this.
Exactly. And now we have that awareness.
Yeah.
Right.
And we need to be responding. So our goal for this podcast is, one, if there are any church leaders who are listening to this, we want this to be a resource for you, and just I don't like checklists, but this is basically a checklist, and we're just going to go right down through. We have, we had to be biblical, of course, so we have a 7-fold checklist. There are 7 things on our checklist, And these are things that churches can do to really improve the quality of your care for survivors in your congregation. Okay? And at the same time to prevent further abuse from happening in the lives of innocent.
These are very practical things that if churches follow these guidelines, you will be providing that safety, that protection, and that atmosphere that survivors are desperately needing within the church.
And I think most importantly, you're going to look more like a first century church that you find when you open up the pages of the Bible. You know, I think that's one of the hard things that I experience as a minister is there is such a disconnect for not only unchurched people, but for Christians. There's this great big disconnect, and they can't fathom what the first century church looks like. And so they create what's called an anachronism. An anachronism is where we read our modern day experiences and perceptions and even realities, we read that back into the biblical text.
I'm shaking my head, which people can't see, and nodding yes, because society in general has changed so much just from when you were a kid.
Oh, I know.
Now.
It's radically different.
You'll see kids walk into church now, not all the time with a Bible in hand, but they'll have a phone with a Bible app on it, or you'll have preachers teaching from a Bible app. And you talk about disconnect from people. There's a big disconnect with communication, period, within every aspect of life anymore.
Yeah.
Here in the U.S., of course.
Well, what I want to do, what I would like to accomplish, several things with this podcast, but one, and I think probably most importantly, is I really want us to look like the church did in the first century. I want us to look like Jesus, because I think right now we have a spiritual crisis, and the fact that people can't bridge that gap in their mind, and they can't enter into the text. See, what I do when I read with a fairly objective lens, I try to be as objective as possible. I try to forget all of my current experiences with church and just go back with an empty canvas and read the New Testament and read about the church with a brand new canvas. And when I do that, I find myself really getting lost in the text, getting lost in the story, getting lost in the life of Jesus. And I find a Jesus who looks nothing like the Jesus who so many people preach about today. And like, the angry fist pounding on the pulpit, and, all these stories that we hear of spiritually abusive church leaders. I don't see that in the New Testament. Now, it certainly existed, but there was no tolerance for it. And Jesus came to squash that and to produce this really incredibly safe environment for survivors of all kinds of oppression and abuse and poverty. And so he came to free those people. So anyway, hopefully this helps. So how do we become that church? How do we look more like that church that we read about in the first century? Well, number one, I think this is incredibly important. Reserve seats at the leadership meeting for survivors. When we have leadership meetings, and I think this is just my opinion, I think not only just kind of given a casual announcement like, at our leadership meetings, if anybody wants to attend who's a survivor of abuse, that you're welcome to come to our meetings. It's one thing to do that. It's quite another thing to make them feel like they're guests of honor, to actually roll out the red carpet and to physically put a reserved sign on chairs at those tables, or at those chairs, the chairs that are at the table, and to actually invite them and have reserved seating for survivors of abuse. to have a seat at the table where these meetings take place, these church meetings. I think that's incredibly important. Number 2, I think this is really important as well. Consult with survivors of abuse before consulting with attorneys. One of the things that drives me insane when I see really crappy policies that these churches put out that do nothing, little to nothing to protect survivors, that do much or all to protect abusers. They protect the identity of the abuser. Right. They allow them to remain anonymous. Right. It's all about protecting the abuser and praying for this brother and, providing support groups and all the things that they don't do for survivors. When we have these really bad policies, inevitably what church leaders will tell me is, well, we consulted with attorneys before we wrote this policy. And my response is, right. Well, did you consult with survivors of right. abuse before you built this policy?
The policy will look a whole lot different if you consult survivors, because they've lived the terror.
Absolutely.
They've lived the trauma, and they can help in forming some kind of policy, some kind of protection, and that's what the church is after. That's what the design should be. Too often we sit in the drawing room, and you know how that is with anything. I think of businessmen sitting in a room I'll change it. I'll think of myself going into the prison teaching. I spend 3 days a week in our local prisons. Mm-hmm. I have people at a much higher state level telling me what I should do and how I should do it, mm-hmm. who have never walked into the prison. Mm-hmm. They don't understand not even the basics of getting checked into the prison, let alone what you're dealing with and the different levels that you're dealing with. So I find I'm having to educate them.
Well, it's a lot like politicians. When church leaders become modeled after politicians who, not all politicians are this way. I'm friends with politicians, so it's not that all politicians are bad by any stretch of the imagination. But so many politicians develop policies that are guided by reports that they're holding in their hand, instead of them actually physically being on the ground and visiting businesses and visiting prisons and visiting people in the community.
Get feedback from those who you're serving.
Yeah. So I think for church leaders to defend poor policies by saying, well, we consulted with attorneys, that's a really, really bad defense, because a lot of attorneys are not rooted in reality if they've not lived it. Right. Or if they've not genuinely spent time befriending people, not just defending people in a court of law, but befriending families that have suffered horrific abuse. Right. So, I would, again, just to restate that, I think it's a simple thing that we can do. Consult with survivors before consulting with attorneys whenever we're developing our policies.
I think that's critical, Jimmy.
Point number 3, include women at these meetings. And again, this is not, I'm not here to change people's theology on women's roles and all that stuff, because there are a lot of people that they just, no matter what you say or how you say it or what Bible verses you float, there are always these anachronisms that take place where we read current or recent past experiences back into the scriptures. And, I know within our tradition, within our religious tribe, so much of what we do right now in 2019 has been guided by a radical knee-jerk response to both the Prohibition Act and the women's suffrage movement. Right. So, those were incredibly politically charged within the church. And, within our tribe, we started seeing language shift from, is it okay? Like, for example, people would write the Gospel Advocate, one of our religious papers that had its heyday back in the 1800s. It still exists today, but people could write to the editor and ask questions, and then the editor would write back, and they would answer these questions. So, at the turn of the century, about 1900, right when this was just so heated up, this women's suffrage movement, and which was directly tied to the prohibition, teetotalist movement, people would write the Gospel Advocate and say, is it okay for a woman to pray publicly in a church service? And the editor would write back, and you know what his response would be? No, it is not okay for a woman to... What language? What language do we hear when somebody gets up and says a prayer in church? They are blanking a prayer. Leading. No, it is not okay for a woman to lead a prayer in a church service. So they shifted the language from praying publicly to now it's a leadership position. I've got news for you. I beg you to find anywhere in Scripture where people praying is a position of leadership. But, our tradition, that was a reaction to what the men thought were women being too forceful, too abrasive, too loud, too boisterous, too divisive. And so they came back and they started using this language. Here's another one, giving thoughts. So in our tradition, we have communion every week. Every church service, we have communion. They would write the question, is it okay for a woman to give thoughts about Jesus and the Lord's Supper, communion? The response would come back, no, it is not okay for a woman to preside over the Lord's table. We still use that language in 2019. Somebody gets up and they give thoughts at communion. They're now presiding over the table. So what we want to talk about is not creating these anachronisms, and we have a lot of them, but we need to include women at these meetings regardless of how we feel about women's leadership roles.
Now, why are you saying that?
Because biblically...
beyond biblically, what I'm getting at is your majority of abused people are
your
women.
Survivors are women.
And that's a fact.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
is a fact. Does that mean that no men get abused? No. But it means your majority are, and so to exclude them from giving their input and thoughts and their needs is really a terrible thing.
Well, it is, but here's another thing. Jesus lived in an incredibly patriarchal society. The Jewish society in the first century was incredibly androcentric. It was male-centered. It was, women didn't have much of any say.
They were second-class subservients.
We've uncovered these synagogues that had separate galleys specifically for women. Right. Women and men were segregated in a lot of the worship services at Sabbath. We know that to be true. So Jesus didn't come and say, you know what, slam his fist down and we got to change women's rules. Jesus worked within that system, and he just kind of quietly and boldly pulled out a chair, and he invited women to have very active roles in getting the gospel out there. Right. The Galilean women. A lot of people don't know this. These Galilean women were wealthy women who supported Jesus through his entire ministry. They were always with him. And a lot of people don't realize without them, Jesus' ministry would have flopped.
It's strange how that's overlooked.
Yeah.
Back to...
So,
it's just
include women at these meetings. When you have meetings, don't shut them out and say, well, the men are the leaders of the church. That's even if you believe that biblically, women still have to have a seat at the table. their voices have to be heard, and it's not patting them on the head and giving them a coloring book and crayons and having them sit in the corner.
Right.
I'm talking about we have to value women. We have to respect them, regardless of what your biblical view is on women preaching and teaching and those sorts of things. We have to value all women and really listen to them and genuinely invite them to sit at our leadership meetings. We have to. Number 4, don't defend known abusers. I can't overstate how many survivors come back to me and they say, we don't know what to do. Our church leaders are radically defending. Just this week, I'm wrapped up in this again. All these emails from a church that I know and I love, and I was a member of. They are radically defending a horrific sexual predator who raped his victims, brutally raped them. This wasn't light petting over the clothes. This guy was a monster. And he did it while he was a preacher and doubled as a youth minister. Humiliated these little girls. Lots of them. And this church radically defends him. He spent time in prison, and now all of a sudden he found Jesus in prison, they think. And they refuse to even name who he is to this church of 1,500 people. That's insanity, and that's dangerous, and I think it's really unbiblical. So, don't defend known abusers. If you have a known abuser in your congregation, listen to the survivors who are crying out, saying, we just want to know who they are, so that we stand a fighting chance to defend our children. Because what happens is, if we're keeping the anonymity of abusers alive in the church, people become friends with them. And they start spending time outside of church. And if you don't know that this person is a horrific sexual predator, your kids don't stand a fighting chance of being safe.
Once again, statistically, we're finding out that abusers don't stop.
No,
I read another story this past week of a man who was in prison because he was a sexual abuser. He was, get this, Jimmy, 90 years old.
Mm-hmm.
He was released. They had his picture of him being locked back up again because the very week he got released, he abused again.
Absolutely.
And that is the norm.
Yeah.
That, please believe us, that is the norm. And an abuser, I would stake my life on it, does not have just one victim. There are multiple victims from that abuser.
Yeah.
So we need to protect our children.
Yeah. Don't defend known abusers. You have no reason to defend them. I don't understand this mentality. They did what they did. Let them own up to it.
Right. Yep.
And part of holding them accountable is saying, look, you need to be completely transparent. Can you imagine, pick any other kind of a sin. We understand accountability, holding people accountable. You own up to your sin. You're transparent. Paul certainly did it. The Apostle Paul didn't hide his past sins and was like, okay, nobody talk about it. Paul was very open. He was like, look, this is what I did. I was the chief of sinners.
Yep.
Paul was very transparent. All the people that you find, all the prophets, they were transparent. Number 5, believe survivors. It's a shame that we even have to say this, but that's where we are. The first response from leaders is typically not to believe survivors. It's to say, well, what evidence do you have? And then they accuse them of slander. Don't be slandering the name of a beloved church member or a beloved church leader. That's typically the first response. We need to change that. And when somebody comes and they cry out and they say, I'm in pain, I've experienced something horrific that's shameful for me to even talk about, the first response ought to be to believe them.
We bristle at that often because the abusers are often so incredibly deceptive. And we've spent podcast after podcast talking about that.
Yeah.
I would encourage others to, listeners, to go back and re-listen to some of those podcasts.
Absolutely.
Because the deception is real and it's layers thick. It does make it difficult to believe that a person who's standing in front of you as this wonderful, caring, loving person that you know can be that deceitful, horrific abuser.
Well, and the other thing, too, if your first response is not to believe survivors, if your first response is, well, you need to give me the evidence and gather it up and, innocent until guilty and all this kind of stuff, if that's your first response, I promise you that you will create a culture in your church where you can guarantee that any other survivor of abuse will rarely, if ever, speak up.
Right.
Because you've ensured that if somebody speaks up, they're going to be interrogated.
Great
they're going to be humiliated. Yeah. So be the church that believes survivors and makes it more comfortable and more safe for survivors to speak up if they're being abused. Because I know if abuse was going on in my church, I would hope that at this point we've created an atmosphere, an environment where people could come to us, to me or any one of the other leaders, and say, I need to share something with you that's on my heart. Mm-hmm. I would hope that by now we have that environment where they feel safe to do so. Number 6, I think it's really important for preachers to preach theories on abuse, but not just generically and say, well, abuse is bad, but to understand the dynamics of forgiveness, to really, truly, genuinely understand forgiveness. And that's not the typical pop culture idea that says, honey, you can't find healing unless you've forgiven your abuser. No matter what they've done and whether they've repented or not, you need to forgive because that's the Jesus thing to do. That is not a biblical view of forgiveness. Forgiveness demands something of the person who took something from you. It demands accountability. It demands repentance. It demands a contrite heart. All of those are precursors to forgiveness. So understand the dynamics of forgiveness and really wrestle with it.
I think that's been something that's so blown up far away from the truth, this forgiveness.
Well, it's been weaponized.
Yeah,
forgiveness has been weaponized and thrown right back at survivors. It's been used to
it's
make
a double
them feel guilty.
traumatization. It really is.
Yeah. So understand the dynamics of forgiveness and also what the Bible says about deception and oppression. And just a little answer to the pop quiz. What does the Bible say to do with people who are perpetually deceptive and oppressors? Paul says it pretty clearly in 2 Timothy chapter 3. Avoid such people. 3 words.
Away.
Avoid such people.
Right.
Have nothing to do with them. If somebody is serially deceptive, and if somebody is serially oppressive and abusive, avoid them. And Paul gives an answer why. Later on in 2 Timothy 3, verse 13, Paul says, evil people and imposters go on from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived. They get worse. They don't get better.
Right.
They love deception.
Just pay attention.
Yeah.
If we would.
So understand that. Preach about it unapologetically. Preach about it boldly. Let your church know there is no tolerance for deception and oppression in your congregation. And finally, number 7, the holy number, which completes this list. Start a ministry for survivors in your community, or for your community. Begin a survivor support group at your congregation. Find a way to make survivors who feel so alone in your community feel welcome and validated and believed. And I think the best way that you can do that is to just start a ministry. It's not that hard to do. It doesn't require any money. That's something that literally, if you can find somebody with a key to your church building who's willing to open it up and let you use the building for an hour a week, all you have to do is start networking with people in your community, other advocacy groups, law enforcement, your district attorney, tap shoulders of people in your community and say, hey, just FYI, our doors are open every Friday from 2 to 3 p.m. or whatever it is. Our doors are open specifically for survivors. They will find shelter and safety and validation inside of our building. We're not going to proselytize. We're not going to, tell them that they need to be Christians or else they can't come back. We are simply here to listen and to love and to validate.
Those three things, that safety and validation especially, are so important, Jimmy.
Yeah.
So very important.
So we leave you with this truth bomb. Our truth bomb is just to give church leaders resources. And if they resist or shut you down, remind them of the church that Christ died for and what it looks like. And if you lack resources to give your church leaders, if there are specific resources that you want to put into their hands or earbuds that you want to put into their ears with a podcast episode, let us know what you would like us specifically to produce. We will do that free of charge. We offer that because we want churches to be getting it right. We will produce those resources, whether it's a blog or a podcast, or just a PDF file, something that you want to print off and give your church leaders. Let us know what you lack, what you need, and we will do our best to work on building that resource and providing it. Thank you for tuning in this week to this podcast. We'll catch you next episode.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker, subscribe on Google Play Music, Apple Podcasts, or Stitcher. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.